So let's think about production externalities a little bit more generally. In the case of a negative production externality, it means that a seller or a producer is making something and they're not paying their way. It means that there are costs that are being imposed on others that they're not taking into consideration. So let's suppose that this firm is a price taker where price is equal to the marginal revenue. You don't need to worry about the jargon on that. Just assume that it's a market where they can't control the price. In other words, they're not a monopolist or something like that. And so this firm calculates that its marginal cost corresponds to this line here, this MC private, or this marginal cost private. So for this quantity, it costs them this much. Go a little further up, this quantity costs them this much, et cetera, et cetera. So as with any firm, they will maximize their profits by producing all the way up into the point where their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost. So they will take a look at this market and they'll say, okay, we can get this amount, this price, and it only costs us this much. So yep, there's a difference there. We'll continue to sell. All the way up to this point, we're like, oh man, we're only making like a couple of pennies here, but we'll still sell it because there's still a penny to be made. And then finally, once it reaches an equilibrium price, they'll say, all right, that's enough. If we go beyond here, then our costs are lower than our marginal revenue, or lower than the price that we can receive. So obviously, we're not going to be selling beyond that point. So that's how they wind up at Q star. So this is where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue, and this is how much they would choose to produce. However, the firm has not taken into account the costs that are borne by society, or the costs that are borne by others. So the last units of output, once we get past this little this mark here, the last units of output cost society more than the benefits. So the optimal point is actually where the total cost of society is equal to the marginal revenue. That way we know that at this point, there's still benefit to society from producing that. Here's the total value to society in the form of marginal revenue, and then the marginal cost curve is still cheaper. So all the way up until this point, it's valuable to have this quantity of services. But beyond it, we start to lose out. So a negative externality in which there are costs that are imposed on others, that results in overproduction, which is exactly the case that we saw in antibiotic resistance. So we wind up at Q star, even though where we really want to be is at Q optimal. So if we want to solve this problem, if this is a broken market, in this particular case, we're overproducing by a lot, and then this whole triangle would be social loss, and so we're worse off than we could be, and economists don't like that. So the government has to find a way to make this firm who's doing this producing feel the pain of the social costs that it's incurring. Or another way to think about it is that they have to pay their fair share. They have to pay their way rather than let somebody else pick up the tab. There are several ways that we can do this. We'll talk about a few of these. So a lot of different ways a lot of tools that market makers have at their disposal to help producers internalize these costs and get the incentives corrected. So a few different options here. One option is simply regulation. So here's our market. This should look familiar. So the most direct thing that you could do is we could just say, all right, we know that Q opt is the right amount, so bang, nobody's going to produce more than this. So we're just going to set a limit on how much of this good can be produced. Another option, which effectively gets to, will get you to the same result, but through different means, is that you impose controls on the production process, which raise the production costs. And that way the firm faces this marginal cost curve relevant to society rather than just their own. So you just basically put a production cap in place and you say, beyond this, you're legally not allowed to produce beyond that. And that way we get to this level of social welfare that's where we don't have this social loss that's bounded by the marginal revenue and then the marginal cost curve for the private producer. In either way that this gets done, the firm will produce the socially efficient amount, which is Q opt. So there are some reasons why you might not want to regulate. That might not be the only or the best way. One of the most important things is lack of information. It can be hard to regulate this well. It's hard to know what firms' costs really are, um, especially from an internal point of view. So it can be hard to guess at, how can we tweak those? How can we, change the cost of inputs or whatever. It can be a little bit difficult to know. It's a lot of information. And sometimes it's difficult to find the specific socially optimal quantity. Although some of that can be identified with methods that economists who study externalities use. But sometimes it's an imperfect science, and so sometimes it's not perfectly available. And the technology to enforce some of this stuff can be challenging. There are also, it's not cheap to do. It's not free to regulate and to monitor and to make sure that factories are, not polluting or whatever it is. So there are some administrative costs involved. And then maybe the biggest drawback is that it's sort of a one size fits all. Like if you just say all firms, you can't produce more than this many things or whatever, it treats firms as though they are exactly the same. And that's not necessarily true. So you might have some firm that could change its production process, and let's just suppose that there's like some pollution going on or something, and like that's an externality we want to deal with. So suppose that there's some firm that could change its technology to be much greener, much more environmentally friendly, and they could reduce their consumption, or they could reduce these externalities by a lot. However, if all you have is a sort of a blunt instrument regulation, there's really no incentive for them to continue reducing that externality as long as they're below that threshold, that vertical line that appeared in the previous graph, even if it would be cheap for them to do so. So that would be sort of a lost opportunity and kind of a poor incentive. It would not be an efficient way to produce this good or service. Another approach would be to try mergers. So mergers are a way of internalizing an externality. And that's because, well, in the previous example, we showed that there was a firm that was overproducing and then somebody else was picking up the tab. Well, if that firm included that somebody else was picking up the tab within their same organization and it all went to their bottom line, or their social bottom line, if you will, then they would automatically include the incentives of everybody and utility of everybody's welfare in their production choices. So here's sort of a trivial example. So if suppose that there's a brewery and a pretzel factory, and that they're the only two users of a water source, and that this pretzel factory is polluting the water. So in this example, the factory does not take into account the cost of all that polluted water to the brewery. So pretzel factory is just baking along. They don't mind polluting. Breweries downstream, however, and they are trying to bottle beer, and they've got all this polluted water. It's causing them a huge headache, et cetera. So one way to fix this is that you merge these two entities together, and you would get rid of this negative externality. So the brewery could buy out the factory, or vice versa, because then you've got the mega firm, the brewery factory conglomerate. And then neither one of those will be imposing an externality on the other. And as a merged firm, it will choose the socially optimal amount of pollution, which is not necessarily zero. Sometimes you can have like a small amount of pollution that is that an ecosystem can handle and can clean on its own. So it isn't necessarily zero, but it will reach the socially optimal amount because nobody is getting a free lunch, so to speak. It's not the pretzel factory is no longer polluting for free, because as a merged entity, it factors into account the brewery who also wants non-polluted water. There are some major problems with the merger solution, mostly that, in my opinion, I think it's much more common to have externalities that are very diffuse, so that they're spread out across lots of people. It's extremely rare where the only people who care about something are a brewery and a pretzel factory. So you'd have to get everyone who's affected by the pollution together and somehow get them to unify with the producers of this externality. So it's kind of like limited applicability. So you would need the whole town in this case. So like if the residents of the town are drinking this water and they're adversely affected by polluted water, obviously, then the town would have to buy the factory. And that is that is tough to achieve just pragmatically. And then it's very likely that there is more than one factory that's doing it. And so you'd have to buy out everything. And that might have its own set of costs and hurdles, et cetera. So mergers have only kind of limited applicability. I would say they're probably they're a good solution to externalities only when, or predominantly when, there are few people who are affected by it and there's a business case for them to get together.